The train station in the French countryside had all the charm of a forgotten postcard. Mist hung low over the tracks, swirling around the feet of the travellers who scurried under the grey sky like ants carrying bags and impatience. The wind cut sharp, but not even the cold could ruffle the polished efficiency of the porters, moving in synchrony as they loaded the baggage into the belly of the train. Miss Marple stepped off the platform with the sort of grace that came only from years of practice. Her dark woolen coat, neatly cut and plain, hugged her figure without drawing attention, and her small, bird-like frame remained a shadow in the bustle. Her hat, a muted grey, perched above her sharp eyes, which caught everything, from the way the steam hissed through the train's pipes to the minute tremor of the conductor's hand as he adjusted his cap. The train, La Belle Étoile, gleamed in the mist like a jewel set among coal and stone, its exterior a smooth blend of polished mahogany and gold accents, reflected the dull light in a way that promised opulence and hidden truths. Behind the train's gleaming windows the promise of luxury awaited: rich velvet seats, thick carpets, the murmur of champagne glasses clinking in the distance. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, wasn't here for the comforts of fine upholstery. She was here for something far more interesting. She approached the steps leading to the train, noting the quiet tension among the passengers waiting in line behind her. A few, with their well-pressed suits and coiffed hair, were doing their best to remain composed, as if this station, this moment, would be their last taste of the ordinary world before stepping into the unknown. Miss Marple took her time ascending the stairs, the faint creak of the wood beneath her feet matching the soft clink of someone's cufflinks, a high-pitched laugh from behind the nearest window. Inside the air was warm, thick with the scent of fresh-cut wood and lingering perfume. The compartments stretched ahead like narrow corridors of intimacy, each one closed off, promising privacy. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the first few passengers she encountered. An art dealer, hands slightly trembling as he fidgeted with his briefcase. A woman who might have been too beautiful for her own good, her red lips turned down in what could have been a frown, or merely a trick of her expression. There were others, some too quiet, some too loud. But Miss Marple knew better than to engage immediately. She would wait. The train conductor, whose hand was still shaking as he checked her ticket, offered a strained smile. His eyes darted over her with the quickness of someone who knew how to hide his nerves behind a facade. He handed her the ticket with a little too much force and a little too little grace, and she gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're not from Paris, I take it," he said casually, watching him straighten, as if he hadn't been aware she was looking at him all along. He blinked rapidly, but before he could answer, the sharp sound of a whistle cut through the moment, and he hurried away, his back stiff. Miss Marple didn't need to hear the muttered words exchanged between him and his colleagues. He was far too eager to be elsewhere. She took a moment longer to watch his retreating figure, then shifted her attention to the compartment she was assigned. The car was almost empty now, save for a man who sat by the window, peering out at the passing station, as if it held the answer to his personal riddles. His attire was immaculate. Bespoke suit, polished shoes, hands folded neatly in front of him, but the calm smile didn't quite match the sharpness in his dark eyes. Miss Marple took her seat across from him, pulling her small leather bag onto the seat beside her. She didn't say a word to him. He didn't say anything either. Instead, they simply shared the silence, comfortable and heavy with a kind of unspoken understanding that only strangers aboard a train can possess. Miss Marple, however, wasn't just a stranger. She was an observer. She tucked her scarf carefully, the soft rustle of the fabric the only sound between them. She was fully aware of the man's presence, and she was aware of his awareness of her. In the reflection of the polished brass trim around the window, his eyes followed her movements just a little too intently. Miss Marple's lips twitched, but she kept her gaze focused on the passing countryside. It was only polite to give someone a moment before acknowledging the inevitable. "Something on your mind, Monsieur Duval?" Miss Marple asked, finally turning to face him with an easy, almost bored smile. The name slipped from her lips as if it had been a matter of fact. She saw no point in feigning ignorance. There were no secrets between her and a fellow passenger, not for long. The man, Monsieur Duval, as it turned out, shifted in his seat, his eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "I do hope I'm not so obvious," he said, his voice low, carrying an edge of something almost dangerous. He seemed more amused than offended. "I have a way of noticing things," she replied coolly. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Just wondering if you're enjoying your trip?" Duval smiled, this time a little more broadly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "As much as anyone could enjoy travelling through such inclement weather," he said, lifting one brow in mock curiosity. "And you, Miss Marple, is it?" "Indeed, but I wouldn't expect anyone to remember my name. I'm not one for attention," she said, tucking her hands neatly into her lap, not missing the slight tightening of his jaw at her words. He took another look at her, eyes lingering just long enough to make her feel the weight of his gaze, and yet here you are, on La Belle Étoile, no less. There's a certain gravitas to such a choice of destination, don't you think? She chuckled, a dry, soft sound. "I suppose so. I'm a sucker for nostalgia," she said, her eyes shifting to the window, watching the landscape blur past. The distant, faint shapes of far-off towns dissolved in the distance. Or perhaps it's the promise of luxury. Who doesn't enjoy being whisked away? But it's the luxury that holds the dark side, Miss Marple. You're a woman of wisdom, I'm sure you know that." "I'm afraid I'm not much for wisdom, but I am familiar with how people hide their secrets in places like these," she said, her voice low but matter-of-fact. "Perhaps more than you might think." His lips tightened into a thin line before he looked out the window again. He was quiet for a moment, and Miss Marple let the silence hang, as if waiting for him to fill it. "Have you ever noticed, Miss Marple," he asked after a beat, "how sometimes it's the most delicate things that carry the heaviest weight?" Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of a soft cough interrupted them. Across the aisle, a man in a military coat, the kind with too many medals and an uncomfortable posture, shifted in his seat, his face flushed, as though he'd been eavesdropping. The clink of his flask in his hand was a subtle reminder that some people didn't take kindly to such deep conversations, but Miss Marple only smiled, her eyes gleaming faintly. "I suppose we shall all learn the weight of things soon enough, won't we?" she murmured, turning her attention back to the darkening world outside. And just like that, the air inside the compartment felt just a little thicker. The train La Belle Étoile started its journey into the unknown, and in its wake secrets began to unfurl, one by one. The dining car was a blend of old-world elegance and modern disquiet. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, golden glow that seemed to soften the sharp edges of the night. The polished silverware gleamed against the white tablecloths, while the low hum of quiet conversation buzzed around the room. The clink of forks against china, the occasional pop of a cork, all seemed calculated to maintain the illusion of refinement. Yet there was something in the air, something too stiff about the atmosphere, like a tight collar that hadn't been loosened all evening. Miss Marple sat near the centre of the room, her place chosen with a quiet but deliberate care. She had an affinity for the pulse of a crowded space, where secrets could be seen in the way people sat, how their eyes moved, the faint tension in the set of their shoulders. She had come for the food, though she was not in the least interested in what was served, and for the company. The finest mysteries often lay within the social currents, not the criminal ones. A discreet French attendant, his movements smooth but sharp, refilled her glass of wine without asking. His hands trembled slightly, as if the weight of the silver tray was too much to bear. He caught her eye, his lips twitching for a moment before he spoke in a low voice. "I hope the journey has been satisfactory, madame," he said, his accent thick but refined. "It has. It's all so orderly," Miss Marple replied, her gaze flicking to the man's face. She noted the slight crease of his brow, the way his lips pressed tightly together. His nervousness was palpable, but not for the reasons one might assume. "You've noticed, then?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "A few of the passengers, they seem on edge tonight. It is Unsettling. Unsettling? She repeated, her tone light but not dismissive. And why is that? The attendant hesitated, clearly weighing his words. There are whispers, and Monsieur Duval, he's been rather insistent about the schedule. Maintenance schedules for the train. He's been talking to the engineer. It's all very peculiar, madame. Miss Marple's eyebrow lifted, a small spark of interest flickering behind her otherwise calm demeanour. Peculiar, she prompted, taking a slow sip of wine, her eyes never leaving the attendant's face. Not to say that he's not a gentleman, the attendant muttered quickly. But there's some about him, something in the way he speaks with the others. There are— He stopped himself, looking around quickly as if the walls might have ears. It's just strange. She nodded, understanding more than he had intended to say. Strange indeed. Thank you for your insight, she said, a touch of dryness in her voice, and the attendant retreated, muttering something under his breath about the kitchen. From her seat, Miss Marple surveyed the dining car. The clink of cutlery was still the predominant sound, but now there was a slight undercurrent to it, a tension she couldn't quite place. Monsieur Duval was seated near the far end of the car, his back turned to her, but his sharp eyes caught hers for just a moment. He smiled, a quick, tight gesture that didn't reach his eyes. Then he turned back to his conversation with the engineer, a man in a dark uniform whose face was flushed in a way that suggested more than simple exertion. Duval's words were clipped, curt, too deliberate in their lack of substance. Miss Marple caught a few words as they drifted across the room. Maintenance, urgent, schedule, not tonight. A faint knot formed in her stomach, but it wasn't from the food. The words felt misplaced, like a door that had been left ajar when it should have been locked. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the rest of the room. The lady in red sat alone at a small table, her lips pursed, her eyes distant. She had barely touched her food, and Miss Marple noticed her gaze flickering to the door every few moments. The military man, with his too tight uniform and too bright medals, had positioned himself near the centre of the car, where he could see everyone and everything. His knuckles, white from gripping his wine-glass, betrayed a tension that belied his calm exterior. In the corner, the art dealer, who had earlier tried to charm the room with empty compliments and name-dropping, sat stiffly, his fingers tapping the table as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. The air in the room was stifling now. Despite the luxurious setting, Miss Marple was acutely aware of the unspoken friction between the passengers, as if each person were playing a part in an elaborate game they didn't fully understand. Before long, the last of the food was cleared away. The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, but something lingered in the corners, too subtle for most to notice. Later, back in her compartment, Miss Marple sat in the dim light of the reading lamp, scribbling in her journal. The train rocked gently as it continued its course through the night, the rhythmic sound of the wheels beneath her a familiar companion. She had always enjoyed the lull of the train, but tonight the motion felt more like the quiet before a storm. She recalled the small, telling moments. The way the art dealer had kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone, the strained attempt at conversation from the military man, his nervous laughter after a comment about fighting battles that never end. He wasn't just hiding something, he was terrified. And the lady in red, always looking toward the window, as if the darkness outside held the answers to her unasked questions. The way she shifted in her seat as the train passed a particularly dark stretch of track suggested she wasn't quite as composed as she appeared. But it was Duval who intrigued her the most. His casual remarks about maintenance schedules and his overly intense conversations with the engineer were too perfect, too rehearsed. She suspected that it wasn't the train's maintenance that had his attention, but something deeper. What exactly he was after, she couldn't say, but she would. As she leaned back in her seat, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The clues were there, subtle and hidden in plain sight. The pieces would fit together soon enough, and there was one other thing that troubled her. Just a small thought that had been niggling at her ever since the conversation with the attendant. The faint sense of unease that had crept in when she'd first boarded. Miss Marple had a rare gift for sensing when things were amiss, and something about the way the conductor had moved, the edge in his voice, made her wonder if there was more at play than she'd initially thought. She closed her journal, setting the pen aside. The train moved on, and so did she. Whatever happened next, whatever came in the form of danger or deception, she was ready. But first, she needed to listen. It was always in the silences that the truth was hidden. The night was still young, and the game was only beginning. It was late, past midnight, when the train had slipped into a dull rhythm, the clatter of its wheels barely noticeable against the stillness of the night. The dining car was empty now, its last remnants of the evening's fine wine and half-eaten meals swept away. The soft hum of the train's engine was the only sound, and the smell of velvet and polished brass hung thick in the air. Then the quiet shattered. The first sound was a muffled thud, distant but powerful, like the crack of thunder against a window. Then came the explosion, a deafening roar that filled the narrow compartment and shook the air out of the train's lungs. The lights flickered once, twice, before they went out entirely, plunging the car into darkness. The entire train seemed to lurch, a heavy groan of steel as it fought to maintain its balance. The high-pitched screech of brakes followed. Miss Marple didn't move at once. Her sharp mind didn't allow for panic, even when the blast threatened to tear through the car's elegant facade. Instead, she sat still, her hand steady on the edge of her seat, feeling the tremor beneath her. The second shock was more chaotic. The flash of light that accompanied the explosion left behind a cloud of smoke that poured through the narrow passageway, curling like a serpent. It smelled acrid, like burnt metal and something worse. The scream started almost immediately, high-pitched, desperate. Footsteps rushed through the hallway, frantic, some stumbling, some purposefully moving in the direction of the origin. Miss Marple's thoughts moved quickly, methodically, even as the train lurched again, groaning beneath the force of the blast. The compartment door to her right was shaking now, as if the frame itself were trying to hold together against the pressure. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked to the small window beside her. The darkness outside gave no comfort. She couldn't tell if the train had stopped or if the world had simply disappeared. The doors between the compartments rattled as if alive, the slight gap letting in a thin veil of smoke. Then a steward, wide-eyed and pale, stumbled into view. "There's been a—" His words were drowned out by another round of shouting from the front of the train. His face was pinched, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Keep calm," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but cutting through the panic. "Tell me where the explosion came from." His eyes darted back toward the front, his hands shaking as they fumbled with his jacket. "Sleeping car. No one sure? There's smoke everywhere." "Lead the way," she said, the calm command breaking through his haze of fear. Without a word he nodded and started toward the front, stumbling once but catching his balance. Miss Marple followed, her mind calculating each detail. The direction of the smoke, the broken glass scattered in the corridor, the sudden silence that followed the initial wave of terror. It was as if everything had paused, waiting for someone to make sense of it. By the time they reached the source of the explosion, the scene was a mixture of chaos and strange calm. The door to the sleeping compartment was partially open, smoke swirling out from the crack like the remnants of a long-forgotten nightmare. Inside, the walls were scorched, the ceiling cracked. But it was what wasn't there that made Miss Marple pause. No blood, no immediate sign of injury, just the remains of a compartment turned to ruin. The train had stopped entirely now. The only sounds were the muffled sobs of passengers, still trying to make sense of what had happened. A few of the bolder ones had begun to push forward, but the others had retreated back to their compartments, some barricading themselves inside. Miss Marple stepped over the threshold of the compartment, her eyes quickly scanning the room. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burnt wood. She noted the odd detail first. The lock on the door was bent, twisted out of shape, but still intact. The explosion had come from within, but how? She knelt down, her hand brushing against the floor just inside the door. A glint caught her eye. A key, not a regular key, but one that looked out of place. A polished, new-looking duplicate key, its edges worn slightly as if it had been used. But the engraving was shut. She picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing the smooth metal. A thought flickered through her mind. This wasn't just an explosion. It was planned, deliberate. The compartment had been locked from the inside, but not by force, by design. The lock had been tampered with, something she had seen in the smallest of details. "Miss Marple," the steward said, standing in the doorway, his face ashen. He had followed her into the room, but was now hesitant to step further inside. "What happened here? Was anyone inside?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, her eyes still on the key. "But someone wanted it to look like an accident." She stood up slowly, turning the key over in her hand. "This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone is trying to send a message. But the question is, who?" The steward shifted uncomfortably. "We've already started to notify the authorities." "Notify the authorities," she repeated, her voice dry. "And if they're like most, they'll fumble through this. No, we need to find out who and why. Quickly." She turned toward the others who had gathered behind her, their eyes wide, filled with fear and confusion. The military man was among them now, his hand tight on the handle of his suitcase, his face drawn and pale. "Do you think they'll strike again?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but betraying the worry underneath. Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She studied the room again, the small inconsistencies, the marks on the floor, the broken window, the way the lock had been tampered with. She wasn't sure, but she felt it. Someone on this train had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't finished yet. "No," she said finally, her voice steady. "Not yet, but I believe they've left us a trail, and it's one we can follow." The sounds of shouting, of chaos, echoed from the front of the train, the passengers still shaken by the explosion. But Miss Marple was already thinking ahead. Her mind was moving too fast for the confusion around her. She looked up, her eyes cold, calculating. "We'll begin with Monsieur Devaux." The name lingered in the air for a moment as everyone in the room stiffened. Miss Marple's gaze flicked back to the steward, whose face was unreadable now. They all had their secrets. But for now, the only secret she cared about was the one behind the locked door. The chaos after the explosion was a brief, jagged thing, like the initial crack of thunder before the storm. It subsided quickly, leaving only the shivering remnants of panic in its wake. The passengers who hadn't run to the front of the train remained behind, clinging to the edges of their sanity as if it were a lifeline. Voices echoed through the corridors, but no one seemed willing to speak too loudly, as if even the sound of their own voices would bring the world crashing down around them. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of the broken compartment, watching the crowd assemble. Her eyes swept over the room without pause, taking in the faces of the terrified, the curious, and the guilty. No one dared move until the steward's trembling voice broke the stillness, calling for help. "They're gone," he said, his words barely rising above the collective murmur of confusion. "Gone, all of them. The compartments, the doors, locked from the inside." Miss Marple didn't need to ask who they were. She could already feel the shift in the air, the subtle weight of something more sinister. They'd all felt it, the brief flicker of dread that passed through the train when the explosion had rattled the car, but this was different. The missing passengers weren't just gone, they had vanished, as if swallowed whole by the walls of the train. It wasn't just the violence of the explosion that unsettled her, it was the eerie calm that followed. "Where's gone?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise with a precision that made heads turn. Duval? And the lady in red. The steward's face was pale, his eyes wide. And the military man and that art dealer, they're all missing, Miss Marple repeated, her tone even, almost amused. Or they've simply gone for a late-night stroll, perhaps to get some fresh air. The steward blinked, his mouth working but no sound coming out. He had no idea what she was suggesting, but it didn't matter. Miss Marple wasn't suggesting anything at all. She was stating facts. Facts that were becoming painfully obvious. The compartments were locked from the inside, just as the steward had said, and yet the passengers were gone. Not a trace, not a sound. The explosion hadn't left a body, hadn't left blood on the floor, hadn't left anything at all. No damage, no immediate signs of violence, nothing except the emptiness. Miss Marple moved past the steward and into the nearest compartment. She ran her hand across the polished wood of the door frame, her fingers lingering on the lock. It was a simple mechanism, but sturdy, not the kind of lock that would give easily. And yet it had been tampered with. Not forcibly broken, no. There were no signs of that. The lock was still intact, but something had shifted. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. She let her fingers trace the edges of the lock, testing its mechanisms, her eyes scanning every inch of the door. When she turned the knob, it gave with a faint click, and she stepped inside. The room was untouched, the bed neatly made, the small table by the window untouched. The only difference was the absence of its occupant. "Did you find anything?" the steward asked, his voice low, as if afraid of waking some terrible thing. "Nothing," Miss Marple replied. Her eyes flicked back to the steward, her gaze sharp. "Except the fact that this lock hasn't been broken, yet the occupant is gone. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone knows what they're doing." She moved toward the next compartment, the steward following her closely. The locked doors were all the same, seemingly untouched on the outside but completely empty on the inside. The very definition of an impossibility. The passengers were missing, and there was no evidence to explain where they had gone, how they had gone, or why. The only thing that didn't make sense was the order in which it had happened. The explosion had been quick, loud, and destructive, but it had been just the right kind of distraction. It had allowed someone, or perhaps several people, to vanish without a trace. "The lady in red," Miss Marple muttered, as she stepped into the next compartment. "Always the first to disappear when the lights go out." The steward gave her a confused look, but she was already on to the next detail, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The art dealer, the military man, Duval. All of them were missing, but it wasn't just their absence that told her something important. It was the fact that no one had even heard them leave. No sounds of struggle, no shouts, no confusion, nothing but silence. And that, she knew, wasn't something that just happened by accident. This wasn't a case of runaway passengers. It was something far darker. "They're not gone," she said suddenly, turning to face the steward. "They're hiding. They're somewhere on this train." "Hiding?" The steward's face twisted with disbelief. "But why? Why would they hide? After all this?" "Because they know something," Miss Marple said. "Something they don't want us to know." There was no sound as she turned back toward the rear of the train, her mind working through the possibilities, all of them twisting around each other like a knot. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces fit together. But the puzzle wasn't finished yet. In the distance she could hear voices, frantic now, some of them rising in pitch, others lowering to whispers. She could see the train staff running up and down the aisles, their movements jerky with fear. But Miss Marple didn't hurry. There was no need. The answers weren't in the panic. The answers were in the calm. The answers were in the emptiness. The game had changed. What had once seemed like a straightforward explosion had turned into something far more complicated. Someone had pulled the strings, and they were pulling them still, and Miss Marple was already a step ahead. The chaos had settled into a low, uncomfortable hum. Passengers milled about in the narrow corridors, their eyes wide, voices muffled but thick with fear. The steward was still hovering near the broken compartment, his eyes darting nervously from one face to the next. It was all noise and panic, none of it helpful. In the midst of it, Miss Marple stood still, her presence a quiet anchor against the storm of confusion. She had already seen enough to know that there was something more at play than a mere explosion. There was a plan behind the panic, a design to it that couldn't be ignored. While others were lost in their own hysteria, Miss Marple moved methodically, her steps slow but deliberate. Her keen eyes scanned the wreckage with the kind of detached calm that most would envy in a crisis. The compartment door had been left ajar, and through the gap she could see the remnants of the destruction. There was no immediate sign of injury, no blood, no broken limbs, but there was something about the way the room was scattered. The furnishings were upturned, the walls slightly scorched, but it was the finer details that caught her attention. She stepped inside, past the steward who was still hovering nervously by the doorway. A trace of soot lined the edge of the compartment wall, so faint it was almost invisible against the wood panelling. It was the kind of mark one might expect after something mechanical had malfunctioned, but there was no sign of a fire. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, acrid and thick, but it hadn't caused the damage it would have had there been a true blaze. Her fingers hovered just above the surface, lightly brushing the soot without disturbing it. It was the kind of work that came from long familiarity, the kind of detail you didn't notice until it was too late. The soot had been placed deliberately. Whoever had been behind the explosion had known how to cover their tracks. "Miss Marple," the steward said, his voice tight. "What do you think happened here?" She didn't answer immediately. Her attention was on something else now, a glint of metal hidden beneath the mess. She leaned forward, lifting a thin brass key from where it lay half buried under a pile of charred curtains. It wasn't a regular key. It was too polished, its edges still sharp, its engraving precise. She turned it in her fingers, noting the intricate design on the key. It wasn't a part of the train's usual mechanism. The brass was fresh, untouched by time. A key like this shouldn't have been here. This wasn't a tool for maintaining the train, nor was it something any passenger should have had access to. It was a key to something hidden, something that wasn't meant to be found. Her eyes narrowed as she examined it more closely. The engraving was small, but clear, a series of numbers and symbols that made no sense at first glance. A code. She pocketed the key without saying a word. The steward hadn't noticed. The more he fidgeted, the less useful he became. He was like a background player in a play that was already halfway through its performance. Turning her attention back to the compartment, she knelt down and examined the floor. The soot on the wall had been carefully placed, but it was the faint, almost imperceptible impressions on the floor that caught her eye next. They weren't deep, just enough to show where someone or something had been moved. The marks were too clean to have been caused by a fall or rush of movement. They were precise, like someone had dragged something heavy and left behind the faintest trace of pressure. She stood, the pieces fitting together in her mind like a puzzle she'd been solving for years. There was a hidden passage, not visible, not obvious, but there. The explosion had been a diversion, nothing more, a tactic. The key had been left behind to point her in the right direction, as if to say, "This is where you need to look next." She turned back to the steward, who was now nervously glancing over his shoulder. The panic in his face was only increasing. "There's a hidden corridor in this car," she said quietly, though her tone carried the certainty of someone who had already figured it out. "That's where they've gone." The steward's face paled even further. "A hidden corridor? Do you honestly think an explosion could cause this much destruction and leave the compartment untouched? Whoever planned this didn't want us to know where they were going," Miss Marple continued, her voice measured. "The question is why, and what they're hiding." The steward was shaking his head now, his hands trembling at his sides. "I don't know. I don't know anything about any hidden passages. I've worked this train for years, Miss Marple. I swear to you, She didn't let him finish. She turned, her gaze focused on the compartment's far wall, where the soot marks and the faint impressions on the floor led her. There was something behind the wall. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Move this," she said, gesturing toward the small side table beside the bed. It was the only piece of furniture that hadn't been completely scattered across the floor. The steward hesitated for a moment, then moved the table aside, revealing a small, faintly scratched panel in the wall. "There," Miss Marple said, pointing. "It's not much, but it's enough." He stared at the panel, as if he'd never seen it before. His hand hovered over it, but he didn't touch it. Miss Marple stepped forward and pressed her fingers into the edge of the panel, gently pulling it back. There was a faint sound, like wood sliding against metal, before the hidden compartment behind it revealed itself. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to slip through, and dark beyond the edge of the panel. A staircase led downward, disappearing into a void that held only shadows. "Well," Miss Marple said, glancing over her shoulder, "it seems we've found the way out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a few questions to ask our missing passengers." The steward's face had gone ashen, but Miss Marple didn't wait for him to catch up. He moved toward the hidden passage, her mind already turning over the possibilities. This wasn't about an explosion. This wasn't about destruction. This was about something much bigger, something deeper, and it was all going to unfold in the dark. The train's corridors were a maze of polished wood and velvet, the low hum of the engine cutting through the uneasy silence that had descended on La Belle Étoile. After the explosion, the passengers had been herded into the dining car, most of them too rattled to speak in more than hushed whispers. The atmosphere was tense, charged with suspicion. Everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody could put it into words. Miss Marple wasn't concerned with the general panic. She had already moved past that. It was the details, the things that others overlooked, that would lead her to the truth. She had a way of making the pieces fit, even when they seemed to resist each other. She moved through the narrow hallways with a measured calm, her eyes scanning every corner, every face she passed. People were too afraid to notice her, which suited her just fine. The conductor was the first person she sought out. His nervous fidgeting as he paced up and down the hallway had caught her attention earlier. He was jittery, his uniform slightly dishevelled, evidence of a man struggling to keep control of a situation he didn't understand. Miss Marple intercepted him as he made his way back to the front of the train, his face pale and drawn. "Excuse me, monsieur," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to ask you a few questions about what happened." He looked up, startled, his hand tightening around the clipboard he was holding. He glanced quickly over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. I'm just trying to keep things under control," he stammered. His voice wavered between uncertainty and a thin veneer of authority. "I haven't had time to make sense of any of it. The explosion, the passengers—" "I'm not asking about the explosion yet," Miss Marple interrupted, her tone cutting through the rambling. "I'm asking about the locks. You're responsible for the safety of the train, aren't you?" The conductor swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "The locks? Well, yes, of course. But there's been some unforeseen adjustments to them. Maintenance work, that's all." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the rear of the train as if looking for an escape. Miss Marple repeated, her gaze sharp. "What do you mean by that?" He shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "You know, regular work on the doors. A few of them had become stiff, weren't closing properly. The maintenance crew—" He stopped short, realizing he was revealing too much too quickly. "I'm not the one to talk about that," he added quickly, his hands trembling as he fiddled with the clipboard. "I just do my job, madam." Miss Marple didn't press him immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, giving him a chance to reconsider his words. The hesitation was obvious now, the way his eyes darted between her and the door, as if he could somehow escape the conversation. "The locks," she continued, her voice even, "weren't standard procedure, were they? You had someone working on them?" The conductor's face paled further. "I don't know about that," he muttered, his voice growing quieter. "I only know the work was done, but it wasn't done by me." He seemed to gather himself for a moment, taking in a sharp breath. "Look, I'm just trying to keep the train moving. There's been a lot of confusion and we need to get back on schedule." Miss Marple could see the anxiety in his face, the way his fingers kept twitching toward his collar, as if trying to adjust something that wasn't quite right. She knew when a man was lying, or at least trying to cover something up, and this man was definitely hiding something. "Tell me, monsieur," she asked, her voice softening just enough to make him feel he had room to speak, "who authorized the maintenance on the locks?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking around as if seeking the safety of some unseen authority. He stopped himself, then quickly added, "I can't say. I don't know. You'll have to ask the chief engineer about that." "Very well," Miss Marple said, her voice light but firm. "But I'll warn you, monsieur, people don't act this nervous unless there's something they're hiding. I suggest you start thinking carefully about what you've told me." She turned then, leaving him standing in the corridor. He didn't follow her, but she could feel his gaze on her back as she made her way toward the engine. She had his number, and it was only a matter of time before he cracked under the pressure. As she walked, her mind raced. Maintenance work on the locks, that much was certain. The conductor's words had been too careful, too rehearsed to be completely truthful. She knew there was more at play here than simple mechanical failure. The locks had been tampered with, and the passengers, those who had disappeared, had vanished in a way that could only be described as deliberate. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. The chief engineer's office was at the front of the train. Miss Marple approached it with the same methodical pace, her eyes scanning every detail, noting the position of the staff, the quiet murmur of voices in the adjacent compartments. She could hear the low hum of the engine, but no one seemed to be particularly concerned with the operations of the train itself. They were too busy trying to make sense of what had happened. She knocked lightly on the door to the chief engineer's office and waited. A moment later the door creaked open to reveal a middle-aged man with a thick moustache and dark eyes that looked tired but sharp. He stared at her for a moment before stepping back and letting her enter. "Miss Marple, I assume?" he asked, his voice steady, though it carried a faint edge of surprise. "Indeed," she replied, her tone polite but to the point. "I need to ask you about the maintenance done on the locks. The conductor tells me that there have been some unforeseen adjustments." The engineer's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. "Adjustments?" he repeated, his lips pressing together in a tight line. "Yes, there was work done on the doors, but it was routine. Nothing to concern you." "Routine?" Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then why would the locks be tampered with in such a way that no one could open them from the inside?" The engineer stiffened, his fingers drumming against the edge of his desk. "There's nothing unusual about the locks, madam. They're built for security, nothing that would stop someone from escaping if they wanted to." Miss Marple took a moment before responding. She could feel the tension in the room now, the subtle shift of something deeper at play. "What about the key?" she asked, her voice casual but cutting through the thick air. "The one found in the compartment. It wasn't one of the usual keys. Someone had a duplicate made. That's a bit more than routine, wouldn't you say?" The engineer's face shifted, his eyes flickering toward the desk as if trying to hide a thought. But Miss Marple caught it. She caught everything. "The key," he muttered, "was an oversight, nothing more. I can't speak to what happened with it. It's all beyond my responsibility now." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft with a quiet challenge. "Then I suggest you find someone who can speak to it, before we all start asking more questions than you can answer." She turned on her heel, leaving the chief engineer standing there, his face betraying the faintest trace of something that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't far from it either. The night was thick and quiet, the kind of stillness that blankets everything. The countryside, the train, the passengers, like a heavy coat. Through the windows of La Belle Étoile, the passing scenery dissolved into blurred shadows, the occasional flicker of distant lights barely visible in the dark. Miss Marple stood by one of the large windows in the lounge car, her reflection ghosted in the glass as she looked out into the void. She wasn't watching the dark hills and fields pass by, though. Her mind was elsewhere, already several steps ahead. It was then that she noticed him, Monsieur Duval, lounging in a corner of the car, looking effortlessly at ease. He had been quiet since the explosion, blending into the background with the sort of calculated composure that marked a man accustomed to hiding his intentions. His tailored suit, dark and well-fitted, made him look every bit the refined gentleman, but there was something in the way he sat, too relaxed for someone who should have been shaken by the events. His eyes, too sharp for his charming smile, were scanning the room, studying people without seeming to focus on any one thing for too long. The moment he saw her noticing him, he stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He made his way toward her with an almost predatory grace. She didn't flinch. She never did. "You seem a little too calm for a situation like this," Miss Marple remarked, her voice steady but carrying a sharp undertone. She didn't need to say more. The words were an invitation, a prod. Monsieur Duval's smile didn't falter. It never did. "One learns to keep one's composure in trying situations, Miss Marple," he said smoothly. His French accent made the words sound almost like a casual observation, as though he were commenting on the weather. "But you're right. This is a most unfortunate event. I'm sure the authorities will have everything in order soon." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, but her eyes narrowed. She wasn't listening to his words as much as his tone, his body language. It was the kind of conversation that only an experienced liar could navigate. Too smooth, too rehearsed, like a practiced performance. "What about the train's interior?" she asked, her voice casual, the question slipping out like a slip of paper tucked between the cracks. "The maintenance schedule, the locks, the doors. Do you know much about them?" His eyes flickered for a brief moment before he smiled again. "The train? Well, it's quite a marvel of engineering, isn't it? A few technical details I've picked up, naturally. The engineers are ever so helpful, and one can't help but learn a few things while travelling. Some of the locks have been adjusted, I believe. Nothing major, but you know, things wear down." The mention of the locks wasn't lost on Miss Marple. The train's locked compartments had been a point of interest for her, especially the fact that they hadn't been tampered with by force. Duval's casual mention of the locks wasn't something the average passenger would even think to mention. He knew more than he should, that much was clear. "You sound quite familiar with the inner workings of the train," she said, her voice turning a fraction sharper. "A passenger wouldn't usually know those kinds of details. You've been speaking to the engineers?" Duval didn't flinch, but there was a slight twitch in his left eye that wasn't lost on Miss Marple. "Ah, you know," he said, his smile never wavering. "I have a certain interest in mechanics. Nothing too serious. Just a hobby." It was a flimsy explanation, and Miss Marple wasn't fooled. She didn't speak for a long moment, allowing the silence to linger. Her mind was already racing through the implications of his words. Hobby? An interest in mechanics? That didn't fit the picture of the suave, well-dressed gentleman he presented himself to be, and it certainly didn't explain his familiarity with the train's technical aspects, details no one else would have known unless they'd been deeply involved with the inner workings of the train, or had a reason to be. "Interesting," she finally said. "Very interesting." Duval shifted uncomfortably, but quickly masked it with another smile. "I'm sure you have more pressing matters to attend to, Miss Marple," he said, taking a step back, "and I'm sure we'll meet again soon." Miss Marple let him retreat, watching as he disappeared back into the shadows of the train. She wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he knew too much, that suggested he was hiding something. And not just from the other passengers. She made a mental note of everything he'd said, even the offhand remarks. The mention of technical details was no mistake. Duval had a hand in this somehow, whether directly or indirectly, and Miss Marple wasn't about to let him slink away unnoticed. The next few hours were a blur of conversations, some tense, some evasive. Miss Marple moved between the compartments, her eyes never missing a detail. Each passenger had their own little story to tell, their own angle on the events that had unfolded. She had no illusions about the truth coming easily. People lied as naturally as they breathed, especially when they had something to hide. But she knew how to sift through the nonsense. Her first stop was the art dealer, a man with more fine jewellery than sense. He was seated in his compartment, a drink in hand, trying his best to look unaffected by the night's events. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a touch too smooth. "What a disaster, truly. I'm shaken, of course, but one mustn't let such things ruin one's evening." "Of course not," Miss Marple said dryly. "But I'm curious, monsieur. What were you doing when the explosion happened?" The art dealer raised an eyebrow. "I was in my compartment, naturally. A man of my stature doesn't often venture too far from his comforts, you know." "Of course," Miss Marple repeated, her gaze unwavering. "And how long have you known the other passengers? You're all rather, well, acquainted, aren't you?" He shifted uncomfortably, tapping the side of his glass. "We've met in passing, here and there. Of course, one always meets the most interesting people on such journeys." Interesting. Another word that didn't sit right. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual about Monsieur Duval?" she pressed. "That seems to know an awful lot about the train's workings." The art dealer's eyes narrowed for a moment before he forced a smile. "Duval? Oh, I wouldn't know. I can't say I've paid much attention to the man. He's not someone I care to engage with, if you understand." Miss Marple nodded slowly, making a mental note of his discomfort. It was the usual deflection, a quick pivot to avoid suspicion. But she wasn't fooled. His eyes told a different story than his words did. There was more to this man than met the eye. Her next stop was the military man, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his uniform sharp and immaculate, his demeanour stiff and disciplined. But there was a crack in the armour, a faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his collar. "Major, you were in your compartment when the explosion occurred?" Miss Marple asked, her tone neutral but sharp. "Yes, Miss Marple," the Major replied, his jaw tight. I was shaken," Miss Marple interrupted with a slight smile. "It's only natural." He hesitated before nodding. "Yes, shaken, but I've been through worse." "You're not the only one," she said dryly. "Tell me, Major, do you know Monsieur Duval well? You seem to have crossed paths with him several times." The Major's eyes narrowed at the mention of Duval. "I don't know the man. He's a bit too refined for my tastes. I keep to myself." "How very convenient," Miss Marple remarked, her lips curling just slightly. "Though you and Monsieur Duval both seem to share an interest in the train's schedule. I overheard a rather interesting conversation you had earlier. Care to explain?" His face turned hard, his eyes cold. "I don't appreciate being listened to." Miss Marple gave him a pointed look. "Noted. But you're avoiding my question, Major." The Major opened his mouth to retort, but seemed to think better of it. He stared at Miss Marple for a long moment before finally speaking. "I don't know anything about any locks or hidden compartments. I was in my compartment, Miss Marple. End of story." Miss Marple's smile never faltered. "We'll see, Major. We'll see." Both interviews had provided pieces, but not the full picture. The art dealer's attempt at deflection, the Major's thinly veiled hostility, all signs pointing in different directions. Yet each spoke of Duval in a way that made Miss Marple's suspicions grow. As the train continued its journey, Miss Marple's mind remained sharp, her observations meticulous. One of these people was lying, and she intended to find out which one. The train, La Belle Étoile, had settled into a thick silence after the chaos of the explosion. The frantic murmurs had quieted down, replaced by a tense stillness that clung to the passengers like a thick fog. No one spoke of the missing passengers directly, but the question hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet understood. The very walls of the train seemed to breathe with the secrets that had been hidden away for years. Miss Marple moved quietly through the train's dim-lit corridors, her soft leather shoes making little sound against the well-worn carpet. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a sharp contrast to the musky scent of fear that had permeated the dining car earlier. She had been in the thick of things for long enough to understand that the real answers never came from the panicked rush of voices. It was the quiet places, the hidden corners, where truth tended to reveal itself. Miss Marple wasn't here to solve this puzzle by asking direct questions. She had learned long ago that questions often clouded the truth. It was observation that was the key. Observation and a knack for noticing what everyone else overlooked. As she moved deeper into the heart of the train, the corridors became narrower, the lighting dimmer. The sound of footsteps ahead echoed just out of sight, making the claustrophobia of the place more pronounced. Each corner she turned brought her closer to where the maintenance rooms should be, a part of the train that no passenger had reason to explore. The train had its secrets, and Miss Marple had every intention of uncovering them. She passed the passengers' cabins, most of them now quiet, doors shut, a few murmurs of conversation drifting from behind closed windows. She ignored them, focusing instead on the space between the rooms where service doors and stairwells connected the various parts of the train. One particular door, tucked behind a narrow staircase, caught her attention. It was a maintenance door, usually locked, the kind that wasn't meant to be seen by any but the staff. It was ajar, just enough to catch her eye. A crack in the otherwise uniform facade. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the doorknob. The air felt different here, cooler, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She pushed the door open just a fraction and peered inside. The dim lighting barely illuminated a narrow passage, the walls lined with pipes and unremarkable tools scattered about. The faint smell of oil and metal hung in the air. She stepped in, the door closing softly behind her. The passage was small, a tight squeeze, but it wasn't the confined space that had caught her attention. It was the layer of soot dusting the floor and walls. There had been a fire, but not a proper one. This wasn't the kind of soot left by an explosion. It was finer, more deliberate, like someone had taken the time to leave it behind. A trail, a trace. Her eyes followed the soot to the far end of the corridor where a wall met the floor. Her gaze moved downward, and she caught the faintest hint of something unnatural. A panel in the wall, half hidden behind the disarray of tools and crates, was ever so slightly displaced. Miss Marple crouched, her fingers lightly brushing against the panel. There was a seam where the wood met the stone, a line that wasn't supposed to be there. She pulled it gently, and the panel came free with a soft creak. Beneath it lay a dark, narrow passage, too small for most adults to fit through comfortably, but it was there, just waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple stood back for a moment, considering. There had been no mention of hidden passages during the briefings, no hints in the staff's reports. She knew better than to rely solely on what the staff told her. The clues were always hidden in the details, those little things that seemed out of place. The soot marks, the panel, the smell of oil, the way the maintenance door had been left open in a place that was supposed to be sealed off. It was all part of something much bigger than a simple explosion. The missing passengers, the locked compartments, the carefully timed diversion, all were pieces of a carefully crafted plan. She stepped through the narrow passage, her steps cautious, the walls pressing close as she moved further into the dark. The passageway twisted slightly, the dim light from the corridor barely reaching the end. She could hear her breath, slow and deliberate as she moved forward. At the far end of the corridor, the passage opened into a small room, unfinished, cramped, and far from the pristine, polished image of the rest of the train. There were more tools here, discarded and rusting, and shelves stacked with spare parts. A few crates stood against the walls, their labels faded and unreadable. What caught her attention, however, wasn't the debris or the clutter. It was the faint markings on the floor, worn from the repeated steps of someone who had come through here regularly. The footprints were too clean to be from anyone other than the person who had been using this hidden passage. She kneeled down to examine them, noting the sharp, deliberate way the marks had been made. Someone had been here recently. Someone who wanted to make sure this space stayed hidden. And that someone had been moving with purpose. They'd come through this passage before, perhaps to transport something, perhaps to hide something, but certainly with intent. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, piecing together the puzzle. The train had secrets, but this passage wasn't just about hiding things from passengers. No, this was bigger. This was about escape, about evading the watchful eyes of anyone who might be looking too closely. And the soot that was left on the walls was the signature of someone who didn't want to be followed, someone who didn't want their movements traced. She rose to her feet and carefully replaced the panel. The narrow corridor and the secret room would remain hidden for now. The rest of the train would go on, oblivious to the quiet trail she had uncovered. But Miss Marple knew that this was only the beginning. The game had just shifted. As she made her way back to the main corridor, her mind raced with the possibilities. Douville, the military man, the art dealer, they all had something to hide, but none of them were as careful as they thought. The clues were stacking up now, each one leading her closer to the heart of the mystery. But first, she had to make sure the rest of the train didn't know what she had found. The last thing she needed was for someone to suspect her interest in the hidden spaces. With the weight of the secret pressing against her, Miss Marple stepped back into the light of the train's main hall, ready to follow the next thread of the unravelling mystery. The train hummed steadily through the night, its polished wooden walls bathed in the soft glow of gas lamps, flickering in rhythm with the rocking motion of the car. A storm had passed hours ago, leaving the air damp and heavy, but the train itself, as always, was a sanctuary of luxury, its passengers cocooned in their own worlds. Miss Marple, however, wasn't interested in the usual comforts of her compartment. She had a far more pressing matter on her mind, something that simmered beneath the surface of the train's high society veneer. She'd already seen too much. The missing passengers, the locked doors, the strange maintenance reports. She had a nagging feeling that something deeper was at play, and tonight she was determined to find out what. She moved through the narrow, well-worn corridors of La Belle Étoile with the quiet grace of someone who had travelled many times before. The hallways, though rich in design with their brass fixtures and velvet curtains, felt oddly oppressive tonight. Too tight. Too close. The flickering lights above did little to ease the sense of claustrophobia creeping in from all sides. The sounds of distant laughter and the clink of glasses barely reached her ears. The noise of the train's journey was constant, but it was the silence in between that unsettled her. She reached a point where the hall split, where the passenger compartments gave way to a narrow service corridor. The door was already cracked open, just wide enough to allow her to slip through without being noticed. A few quick steps, and she was inside, the sound of her soft shoes muffled by the thick carpet. The service corridor was dimly lit, the lamps hanging low and casting long shadows against the walls. The narrowness of the space felt suffocating. Miss Marple kept her steps light as she moved past the rows of compartments reserved for staff. She had no intention of going far, she just needed to see for herself if there was anything that didn't belong, anything that would explain why the train seemed to be hiding something. She reached a door at the far end of the corridor marked with the word Maintenance. It was a small, unassuming door, barely noticeable in the shadows, the kind of door most passengers would never even think of. But Miss Marple wasn't most passengers. Her fingers brushed against the brass handle, testing it. It was locked, of course. Most things were locked on a train like this, and there was always a reason why, but Miss Marple wasn't about to be stopped by a simple lock. She dealt with far trickier problems before. She bent down, inspecting the lock carefully. The metal was old, well-worn, and she could see the faint outline of something odd. Scratches near the edge of the lock, marks that weren't there by accident. A small trickle of soot had built up on the surrounding wood, just enough to catch her eye. It looked fresh, though the door had been locked for some time. Miss Marple's mind began to race, ticking through the possibilities. The soot wasn't a natural accumulation, it was too deliberate. Whoever had been through here had known exactly what they were doing. She took a deep breath, pulling herself up and glancing down the narrow corridor. It was empty, no staff in sight, no one to interrupt her investigation. She slid her fingers along the edge of the doorframe, pressing lightly until she felt a faint give. There was something behind it, something hidden just out of view. With a quick, practiced motion, Miss Marple pushed the door inward. It creaked open, revealing a small room filled with old tools, crates, and unmarked boxes. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. It was a kind of room that most passengers would never even think to enter, and the kind of room most employees wouldn't care to talk about. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the clutter. Nothing seemed out of place, but her attention was drawn to a patch of floor near the back. A faint impression, barely visible against the wood, it wasn't much. A small indentation, perhaps caused by something heavy. She crouched down for a closer look, her mind working through the possibilities. Her fingers brushed the floorboards, and that's when she saw it. A small panel, barely visible unless you were looking for it. She pulled at it gently, and it came free with a soft click. Beneath it lay a narrow, darkened passageway. A faint smell of fresh wood hit her nose, mixed with the faintest trace of soot. Her heart quickened, not out of fear, but out of certainty. This was what she had been looking for. The hidden passage that everyone had overlooked. The key to everything. She stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness, her thoughts sharp as a knife. Whoever had designed this train, whoever had hidden the passage, had made sure no one would find it. But now that she had, there was no turning back. She had found the heart of the mystery, and it was here, tucked away in the belly of the train, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and misdirection. Miss Marple glanced back one last time before stepping into the passage. The walls of the train felt tighter now, as though the space was closing in around her. The faint smell of soot grew stronger as she moved further into the darkness, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath her. The air was stale, but the promise of answers made the discomfort fade into the background. As she navigated the narrow passage, her mind was already racing through the implications, the missing passengers, the explosion, the locked compartments. They were all connected by this hidden space. Someone had been using it, moving between compartments without being noticed. Someone who knew the layout of the train intimately, who understood the dark corners where secrets could be buried. She couldn't help but wonder who. Monsieur Duval, with his too casual knowledge of the train's inner workings? The military man, with his stiff demeanour and nervous glances? The art dealer, with his hints of secrets left unspoken? They all had something to hide, and now Miss Marple had found the space where they had hidden it. She moved further down the passage, each step bringing her closer to the answers she had been seeking. The train had its secrets, but Miss Marple was getting closer to unveiling them. And whoever had hidden them would soon find they couldn't keep them locked away much longer. As the passage curved sharply, she braced herself for what was to come. This wasn't just about finding a hidden door. It was about uncovering the truth that had been buried deep within La Belle Étoile. The truth about the explosion, the missing passengers, and the secrets that had led them all here. But she knew one thing for sure. She was getting closer. And soon she would have the answers. The narrow passage was a quiet place, deep within La Belle Étoile, the kind of space passengers would never think to look. Miss Marple stood at the entrance, her eyes fixed on the small, intricately engraved key she had discovered earlier. It was a peculiar thing, polished and new, with sharp engravings that marked it as something far from ordinary. She turned it over in her hand slowly, studying every detail, every curve of the metal. The key itself was small, almost delicate, but its significance was anything but. She held it in the dim light, letting her fingers trace the engraving. An almost imperceptible combination of numbers and symbols that gave it the unmistakable feel of something intended to unlock more than just a door. She had already seen the hidden passage, felt the faint unease in the air that came with finding something so out of place. Now this key was the answer to the questions that had been gnawing at her since the explosion. Miss Marple's mind churned through the possibilities. This was no ordinary key. It had been designed with purpose, designed to open something hidden. Her thoughts flickered to the conversation she'd overheard earlier between Monsieur Duval and the engineer, a passing exchange that had seemed so insignificant at the time, but now the pieces were falling into place. She stepped back into the dimly lit corridor, where the faint hum of the train's movement seemed to grow louder in her ears. The walls, too close, the air too thick, were beginning to feel oppressive again. Miss Marple had long since learned to tune out the distractions. This was about something more important. She opened her journal and carefully sketched the key's design, drawing the faint lines with precision, as though putting the key itself under a magnifying glass. The engraving was subtle, too subtle for any casual observer, but it wasn't lost on her. It was the kind of detail only someone with intimate knowledge of the train would understand. The symbols, the arrangement of the marks. They weren't random. She had seen something similar in passing on the blueprints of La Belle Étoile. Something about the maintenance schedule, the workings of the locked compartments. Those technical remarks made by Monsieur Duval earlier had seemed unimportant at the time. A passing comment about the train's interior, something so bland it could have been dismissed. But now it connected to this. She felt a twinge of satisfaction as her mind connected the dots. Monsieur Duval. He had known too much about the workings of the train, far too much for a simple passenger. The lock adjustments he'd mentioned, the way he'd spoken about the train's internal systems with such ease. He had to have been involved, and now, with this key, it was clear he wasn't just a casual observer. Miss Marple tucked the key carefully into her pocket and made a note in her journal, her pen moving quickly. She wasn't the type to leave things to chance, not when every small detail could hold the key to the mystery. She had to know who else had access to the train's maintenance areas. Who else might have known about the hidden passages? The duplicate key was a puzzle piece that fit too neatly into a picture she was still trying to complete. And like all good puzzles, this one wasn't just about finding the right answer. It was about understanding why certain details had been kept hidden, and who stood to gain from the secrets buried deep inside the train. Miss Marple paused for a moment, letting her gaze drift over the dimly lit corridor again. The muffled sounds of conversation from the dining car drifted through the air, but she knew that she couldn't afford to be distracted. She had no time for misdirection, no time for small talk or polite conversation. She needed answers, and she needed them now. With a final decisive glance at the key in her pocket, Miss Marple set off again, moving down the corridor toward the heart of the train. It was time to get to the bottom of this, to figure out who had the keys to the hidden spaces, and more importantly, why they had been keeping those spaces so carefully guarded. And as she walked, she couldn't help but feel the satisfaction of a puzzle coming together. The dining car was resplendent with opulence. White linen, gleaming silver, and crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow that should have been calming, but tonight felt stifling. The passengers, their faces pale, sat in tight clusters, their eyes flickering nervously toward the front of the room where Miss Marple had quietly made her presence known. There was no longer any illusion of comfort in this space. The air felt thick with suspicion, as if it too knew something was amiss. Miss Marple stood at the head of the room, her figure calm and composed against the backdrop of plush velvet seats and the rhythmic clinking of silverware. Her small frame seemed almost out of place in the luxuriously adorned car, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that was unmistakable, one that spoke of years spent watching and understanding the subtle dance of human nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers like a knife, drawing every eye to her, "I believe it's time we talk." The murmurings died instantly, and all eyes shifted, some with apprehension, others with blatant discomfort. The missing passengers, the explosion, and the locked compartments were all hovering in the room like ghosts, and no one seemed willing to speak of it first. But Miss Marple had no such hesitation. "Please," she continued, her words smooth but carrying the weight of authority, "take your seats. I'm afraid there are matters that require our attention." One by one the remaining passengers reluctantly took their places at the long table, their movements stiff, their postures betraying their unease. Monsieur Duval settled into his chair, his usual composure faltering just a bit as his eyes flicked toward Miss Marple. The military man, his jaw clenched tight, leaned back in his chair, his hand resting too firmly on the table. The art dealer and the lady in red exchanged brief glances before she turned away, her fingers nervously drumming against the edge of her glass. Miss Marple took a moment to study each of them. Their behaviour told her more than they could have realized. "It's strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple began, her gaze sweeping across the table. "How quickly things go awry when a few simple facts are twisted, hidden, or ignored." The tension in the room thickened, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "The last night's explosion? Truly a disaster. A few were lucky enough to remain unscathed," she continued, her voice as steady as the slow, rhythmic clink of a spoon against china. "But what about the others? What about those who have vanished?" She let the question linger, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she let each passenger contemplate the gravity of her words. "The missing passengers weren't simply victims of an accident," Miss Marple added. "No, there's more to this than meets the eye. Someone here knows exactly what happened and why." The silence that followed was heavy. Not a single person moved, their faces betraying the unease they felt, but none of them spoke up. Miss Marple wasn't expecting them to. The answers were never in the initial panic, nor in the questions asked aloud. They were in the subtle exchanges, the way people shifted their weight in their seats, the tightness around their eyes. "I think we should start with the facts," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and her eyes never leaving those of her fellow passengers. One by one, Miss Marple began to piece together the night's events with quiet precision. She spoke with deliberate slowness, her voice methodical as she recounted what had transpired. "The explosion was no accident," she began, looking briefly at the lady in red. "It served its purpose, didn't it? A distraction, a smokescreen, nothing more. And in the midst of that chaos, a few of you found the opportunity to disappear." The lady in red shifted in her seat, her fingers going still for the first time since the conversation began. She didn't meet Miss Marple's eyes. "The locks," Miss Marple continued, shifting her gaze to Monsieur Duval, who was sitting with his arms folded, his lips curled in a tight smile. "Those locks were tampered with. Not just the one in the compartment where the explosion occurred, but the others as well, sealed from the inside, without force, without any obvious signs of break-in. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Monsieur Duval's eyes flickered just a fraction, but his expression remained smooth. He tilted his head, a small gesture of acknowledgement, but no words followed. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a moment before she moved on. "The soot," she said, turning her attention to the military man. "A strange little detail, don't you think? The soot on the walls, the faint marks left behind like a signature. Whoever was behind this didn't just cause an explosion. They wanted to make sure they were covered." "Literally." The military man's jaw tightened, his hands still resting on the table, but his fingers were now slightly curled. He stared ahead, unwilling to meet her gaze. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of silence, letting the pieces settle into place. "And then there's the key," she said, her voice even. "The duplicate key found in the compartment. It's a small thing, a seemingly insignificant detail, but it's enough to confirm the theory I've been forming. Someone here had access to parts of this train that most passengers wouldn't even know existed." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Every person seated at the table now knew she was speaking directly to them, her every word laced with implications. The art dealer shifted uncomfortably, his hand fumbling with his glass. The lady in red glanced at him, then quickly looked away, her lips tight. Whoever left that key behind wanted us to follow the truma, Miss Marple said softly, her tone calm but carrying the sharpness of a scalpel. But why? Why leave us something so easily traced? A murmur passed through the table, the tension thickening, the question hanging in the air. The motive, why was it left? Why was it hidden? I'll tell you why, Miss Marple said, her voice suddenly colder. Because someone thought they were above suspicion. Someone here believes they're safe. She let her eyes flick around the table, pausing just long enough for each of the suspects to feel the weight of her gaze. The military man was sweating now, his fingers twitching. The art dealer had stopped fidgeting but still avoided her eyes. Duval, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, his calculated calm unsettling in its own right. The lady in red was still, too still, her gaze fixed on the glass in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Now," Miss Marple continued, the edge of her voice sharpening, "let's move past these small details and get to the heart of it. Someone here knows the layout of this train better than anyone should. Someone here had a key to a secret passage to the maintenance areas no one else is supposed to know about. Someone here has been using this knowledge to cover their tracks. The question is, who?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. There was a long pause, during which no one moved. It was the kind of silence that suggested the truth was already circling, just out of reach, waiting to pounce. "No," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but final. "I think we should get to the bottom of this." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. And just like that, Miss Marple knew that the game had changed. The pieces were on the table. Now it was just a matter of watching how each one moved. The dining car, once filled with the murmurs of anxious passengers, now held a quiet, oppressive air. The crystal chandeliers above cast a soft light over the table, but the warmth of the surroundings did little to ease the chill in the room. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, her small frame commanding the attention of every person seated before her. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone was enough. The suspects, each of them tense and wary, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The military man, whose posture had always been rigid, now seemed to shrink into his chair. The art dealer's fingers tapped nervously against his glass, while the lady in red avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Monsieur Duval, however, maintained his usual air of calm, his eyes never leaving Miss Marple's as she surveyed the room with a practised glance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice cool, steady, and "It's time we address what has been happening aboard this train." Her words were deliberate, each one landing with precision. She didn't rush. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the train's motion, and for a moment it felt like the world had stopped, suspended in the tension that wrapped itself around every person in that room. "I know you're all waiting for answers," she continued, her gaze sweeping over them, "and you will have them. But first, let me take you through the facts." Miss Marple paused, making sure her words sank in. "Earlier," she said, "there was an explosion, a loud one that caused immediate panic. But let's not be fooled by appearances. The explosion was a diversion. It was designed to cause chaos, to draw attention away from something else." She let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Someone here," Miss Marple said, her tone growing sharper, "used that explosion to facilitate the abduction of certain individuals on this train, people who had something to lose, and people who could be used to leverage something far more valuable." The art dealer's face paled, his lips tightening as he shifted in his seat. The lady in red's fingers trembled on the edge of her glass, but she remained silent. "The first clue was the soot," Miss Marple continued, her voice now calm and authoritative. "The fine powder on the walls, the marks on the floor. Those weren't caused by the explosion. They were placed deliberately. Whoever caused this knew the train inside and out. They were familiar with its workings. Perhaps too familiar?" She turned her gaze toward Monsieur Duval, whose eyes never wavered. "The second clue," she said, was the duplicate key, a key that shouldn't have existed. It was hidden, left for us to find, but it wasn't just a key. It was a key to a secret passage, a passage that led through the hidden corridors of this train. A slight shift in Duval's posture was the only sign he'd heard her words. His smile, though tight, remained. "And that brings me to the locks," Miss Marple said, her voice lowering slightly. "They were tampered with. Not forcibly broken, but carefully altered. The locks were meant to seem secure, but they were meant to be opened by someone who knew exactly how to unlock them." Her eyes met Duval's now, and for the first time there was a flicker of something. The calm exterior he had maintained seemed just a little less certain. "Those tampered locks," she said, "the soot, the key, the secret passages. It all leads us to one person, Monsieur Duval." A ripple of tension moved through the room, the air suddenly thick with unspoken accusation. Monsieur Duval's calm demeanour cracked ever so slightly as Miss Marple's words hung in the air. His eyes shifted, his lips pressing tighter, but he didn't speak. "You've orchestrated everything, monsieur," Miss Marple said, her voice measured and confident. "And the explosion, the disappearance of the passengers, everything was part of your plan. But why?" Duval's smile wavered for just a fraction of a second. He straightened, his gaze meeting Miss Marple's without blinking. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple," he said, his voice still smooth, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. "I'll tell you what I'm implying," Miss Marple replied, her voice crisp. "You didn't just cause the explosion for the sake of chaos. You used it to cover your tracks, to move your victims without anyone noticing. The explosion was simply a distraction for something far more carefully planned." Miss Marple paused for a moment, letting the room catch up with her words. "The passengers you targeted were influential," she continued. "People whose absence could be used for leverage in financial matters. You knew exactly how to take advantage of the situation." Duval's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. "The where?" Miss Marple said, looking around the room. "Was here, within the confines of this train. The locked compartments and the secret passages led us to this conclusion. The very structure of the train was used to conceal what you were doing. You knew where the hidden corridors were. You've been using them all along?" Duval's eyes flickered. There was a brief moment of recognition, and then his mask returned, smooth as ever. "They with whom?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze never leaving Duval's. "Involved someone else, the train's engineer. He was coerced into providing access to these hidden spaces, forced, perhaps, or perhaps out of greed. But he wasn't an accomplice. He was a pawn, someone you could control." The military man shifted uncomfortably, his face twisted in confusion and something else. Fear, maybe. "And the how?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes sharp. "The key, the diversion, the tampered locks. It all leads back to you. The key was meant to unlock the passageway that you used to move between compartments unnoticed. You thought you could hide in plain sight, but you made a mistake. You left too many clues." A shift in the room came then, a collective exhale, the tension in the air broken by the revelation. Duval's shoulders slumped slightly, his composure faltering. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come right away. He began, then stopped, his fingers curling tightly around the edge of the table. "I didn't expect you to catch on," Miss Marple finished for him. She leaned forward, her voice almost pitying. "You underestimated the value of small details. The key, the soot, the passageway. It was all too neat, too well thought out. You thought you could control the situation, but in the end it's always the little things that betray you." Duval's face was pale now, his earlier charm gone, replaced by a cold hardness. "You were right," he said, his voice flat. "But you've missed the point. This was never about the passengers. This was about power, about controlling information and manipulating those who thought they were untouchable." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. And now you'll have to face the consequences of your little game." As Duval sank into his seat, the others in the room for the first time seemed to breathe easier, the truth now clear. Miss Marple had pieced together the puzzle, and though it wasn't over yet, the web of deception had finally unravelled. The game was over, and it was only a matter of time before Duval would have to explain just how deep his involvement had run. Miss Marple took a breath, feeling the weight of the truth settle around her. "Justice," she said softly, "is never as satisfying as people think, but it's always right." And with that, the final pieces of the mystery slid into place. The dining car was silent, the tension thick in the air as Miss Marple's words hung like a guillotine, ready to fall. The faces of the remaining passengers were painted with a mix of relief and wariness. Relief that the truth was coming out, but wariness at the uncomfortable realization of just how close they had been to something far worse. Monsieur Duval's face, usually a mask of composed elegance, now betrayed cracks. His eyes flickered, just for a moment, with indignation. The calm facade he had so carefully cultivated for the entirety of the journey was beginning to break down, the pressure of his lies squeezing his composure tight. He shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching at the edge of his glass, but he didn't speak immediately. His jaw tightened, his gaze locked on Miss Marple. His polished demeanour faltered, revealing a brief flash of what lay beneath: frustration, but also the unmistakable hint of something darker. "You've made your point, Miss Marple," Duval said, his voice low, but there was a sharp edge to it. "But you have no idea what you're talking about. You're grasping at shadows. I am not the one responsible here." "You're right, monsieur," Miss Marple replied, her voice cool, cutting through his defensiveness with ease. "You're not responsible for everything, just for orchestrating the events that brought us here. The explosion, the disappearing passengers, the secret passages. You didn't act alone, but it was your hand that moved the pieces." Duval's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you have it all figured out, don't you? You've connected the dots, but you've missed the bigger picture." "Oh, I understand the bigger picture perfectly," Miss Marple said with a dry, disinterested smile. "The motive: greed, control, leverage, an attempt to exploit certain influential passengers for your own benefit. The train security, the locked doors, the tampered compartments, they were all part of a well-calculated plan. But it's a plan that failed, monsieur, because you underestimated one thing: me." His eyes flickered for a moment. He wasn't used to being talked down to, especially not by someone who seemed so unremarkable. But Miss Marple wasn't bothered by his arrogance. She had learned long ago that confidence was often the armour of those who were most afraid. "I am a man of influence, Miss Marple," Duval said, his voice rising slightly. "You may think you've caught me, but you haven't. You've only caught a piece of the story. There are far more powerful people involved in this than you realize." Miss Marple's eyes never left his. "If there are more powerful people, monsieur, then I suppose it's just a matter of time before they take their turn. But for now, you're the one under suspicion." Duval's face reddened, and his composure wavered. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "No," Miss Marple replied, "but I know exactly what I'm seeing, and what I see is a man trying to cover up his tracks before the truth catches up to him." The words stung more than Duval would admit. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, and for a split second his eyes flickered with something far more dangerous than indignation. But he masked it quickly, leaning back and forcing a laugh. "You think you've won, Miss Marple?" "I think," Miss Marple said calmly, "you've lost." The moment of silence that followed was thick with anticipation, each breath in the room hanging on the edge of the conversation. Duval remained still, but his eyes flickered to the side, where the train's engineer had been standing quietly, his back against the far wall. The engineer, who had been trying to remain invisible in the corner, now shifted uneasily. The colour drained from his face as he realized the focus was slowly shifting toward him. Miss Marple turned her attention to the engineer, her voice cool but firm. "You've been very quiet, monsieur," she said, her gaze never wavering. "But I think it's time for you to speak." The engineer swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he fidgeted with his cap. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words didn't quite come easily. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he stammered. "I was just trying to do my job." Miss Marple's gaze hardened. "You've been working on the train's maintenance for years, haven't you? You know its layout better than anyone. So, how is it that you didn't know about the secret passage?" The engineer's shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt settling in like a heavy fog. "Duval, he promised me things I couldn't refuse. He told me it was just a bit of routine work. I didn't know what he was planning, not really, but I was scared. He threatened my family." The room seemed to exhale collectively as the engineer's confession spilled out in a rush. Duval's eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched. For the first time, Miss Marple saw a flash of real fear in his expression. "I didn't know about the people he was taking," the engineer continued, his voice quieter now. "I thought it was just a simple job, open a few doors, make sure the train's running smoothly. But when I found out, when I realized what was happening, I wanted out. But Duval, he wouldn't let me." The tension in the room was palpable. The truth had finally spilled out. The engineer had been manipulated, used as a pawn in Duval's scheme, threatened with his family's safety to keep him compliant. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her hands in her lap as the room processed the revelation. She had suspected as much. The engineer had known too much, but his actions had never felt like those of an accomplice. Now it was clear. Duval had used leverage, fear, to turn him into a reluctant participant. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Duval, who now sat frozen, the veneer of control slipping away like a cracked mirror. "You," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but heavy with accusation, "you took advantage of the engineer's fear. You used him as a tool to carry out your plan." Duval looked down, his hands curling into fists. "It was the only way," he muttered under his breath. "The only way," Miss Marple repeated, her voice sharp. "You used fear to manipulate someone into helping you, but it didn't end well for you, did it?" Duval's eyes darted toward the engineer, and then to the rest of the room. The walls seemed to close in on him. His time was running out. "I never wanted it to come to this," he whispered. "But now it's too late." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Not too late, monsieur. You've been caught, but you can still face the consequences of your actions. The truth always catches up." The engineer, his face pale, looked to Miss Marple. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him." "It's over now," Miss Marple said. "You're free from his grasp." Duval, broken and defeated, sat back in his chair. The game was up. He had been outplayed, outsmarted by a woman who had nothing but her mind and an unshakable sense of right. Miss Marple stood up, her gaze lingering on Duval for a moment longer. "The truth is always the hardest thing to face. But now, monsieur, you will face it. And soon, so will the rest of them." She turned toward the door, her mind already turning to the next steps. The mystery was solved, but there was still much to be done. The truth had been revealed, and in its wake there would be justice. But as always, it was never without cost. The first hint of dawn stretched over the French countryside, spilling pale light across the fields and the tracks that snaked through them. The train, La Belle Étoile, had pulled into a quiet station, its slow chugging almost imperceptible against the stillness of the morning. There was a shift in the air, as if the oppressive tension that had gripped the train for so long had finally begun to dissipate, replaced by the weight of expectation. Miss Marple stood at the window of the dining car, watching the station as it came into view. Her sharp eyes noted every detail, the subtle shift in the air, the slight bustle at the station as French authorities began to board. The officers, in their neatly pressed uniforms, moved quickly, purposefully. The calm of dawn seemed to settle over them. but there was an unmistakable sense of relief that began to seep into the very fabric of the train. "Here they come," Miss Marple muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. Her attention was drawn to a group of officers who, after a brief exchange at the platform, began to board the train. Their presence marked the official end to the mystery, the beginning of the resolution. They moved with quiet authority, but it was the sudden shift in the atmosphere that told Miss Marple everything. The situation was under control. Monsieur Duval would soon be in their custody. A moment later the door to the dining car opened and a tall officer stepped in. His presence cut through the last remnants of tension. "Monsieur Duval?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Duval, still seated at the table, remained unnervingly calm, his face a mask of barely contained resignation. He stood slowly, his movements smooth despite the unmistakable edge of defeat in his posture. "You know why you're here?" the officer said, his tone final. "I do," Duval replied softly, his eyes flashing once toward Miss Marple. "It seems I've been caught, but I never thought it would come to this." The officer nodded, motioning for two other officers to move in and take Duval into custody. They led him out of the dining car without a word, but Miss Marple noticed the tension in the room ease ever so slightly. As Duval disappeared from view, the other passengers in the car released the breaths they had been holding. Their collective anxiety lifted, and even the lady in red, who had been frozen in place for hours, allowed her shoulders to relax just a fraction. The officer turned back toward Miss Marple with a nod of acknowledgement. "The passengers are safe, Miss Marple," he said, his voice now softer, the formal tone giving way to a quiet gratitude. "We'll take it from here." Miss Marple only nodded in return, her expression unreadable as she watched the authorities move through the train. The final pieces were falling into place, but she wasn't one for public triumphs. She simply stepped back, allowing the professionals to handle the aftermath. Her work, for now, was done. The next few hours saw the quiet resolution of what had been a tense, harrowing ordeal. The rescued passengers, including the few who had been hidden away in a concealed baggage compartment, were given immediate medical care. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the lingering trauma of what they had experienced. But there was no mistaking the relief that bloomed on their faces as they were finally freed from their ordeal. The train's engineer, meanwhile, was taken aside by the authorities for questioning. He looked a little less ragged now, his shoulders still tense, but his posture had softened since the truth had come to light. Miss Marple watched from a distance as the officers spoke with him in hushed tones. There were no signs of anger or blame, only calm resolution. She could tell that they would be lenient with him. He had been a pawn, manipulated and coerced into complicity. After the engineer had been cleared, Miss Marple made her way toward him. She didn't say much, just offered a quiet glance of understanding as he looked up at her, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and relief. "You did what you had to do," she said simply, her voice low. "But now it's over." The engineer nodded, his lips trembling slightly as he whispered, "Thank you for seeing the truth." Miss Marple gave him a small nod, and for a moment the weight of the case seemed to settle around her, as if all the air had been let out of a balloon. The mystery had unravelled, the puzzle had been pieced together, and now only the last bits remained. As the officers finished their rounds and the train's usual rhythm began to return, Miss Marple stood in the dining car, watching the passengers slowly return to their compartments. There was no real joy in the resolution, no sense of personal victory. She hadn't done this for praise or accolades. She had done it because it was necessary, because, in the end, justice always caught up, no matter how carefully the criminal tried to hide their track. As the train began to roll forward once more, Miss Marple found herself seated by the window, watching the French countryside unfurl before her. The morning light caught the distant hills in a pale glow, the mist slowly dissipating as the world came alive again. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case, though resolved, left her with a gnawing feeling of something left unsaid. The nature of deception, the way people twisted the truth, always struck her as both fascinating and tragic. How easily people thought they could control others with threats, with lies, with fear. And how easily they were caught, in the end, when someone simply paid attention. She thought about Monsieur Duval. He had been clever, no doubt. He had played the game well, manipulating everyone around him. But in the end, it wasn't his cunning or his control that had given him away. It was the simplest thing, his arrogance. He hadn't accounted for the details, the little things that often went unnoticed, the soot, the key, the passageways. It had all seemed so well hidden, but it was those very things that had tripped him up. As the train continued its journey, Miss Marple turned her attention inward for a moment longer. The mystery was solved, and justice would be served, but she knew that the world would keep turning, and that there would always be more to uncover, more puzzles to solve. It was the nature of the world, a world that, on the surface, seemed so neatly ordered, yet beneath was full of secrets. For now she allowed herself a small, contented sigh. The case had been resolved. For the moment, at least, everything was in its rightful place. The soft hum of La Belle Étoile slowed as it pulled into the station, its final stop for Miss Marple. The train, once a source of tension and mystery, now felt like nothing more than an extension of the past. The problem had been solved, the perpetrators caught, and the secrets of the journey laid bare. It was early morning. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting a gentle golden light over the rolling hills of the French countryside. The air was cool, crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the night before. Miss Marple stood at the window for a moment, watching the landscape pass by as the train slowed to a halt. She had no need to rush. There was no further mystery to unravel here. The answers were all in her mind now, carefully filed away. She stepped off the train with the same quiet grace she had displayed throughout the case. The station was peaceful, almost idyllic, with only a handful of early risers moving about. A few porters busied themselves with luggage, and the faint scent of freshly baked bread drifted in from the nearby village. The train's bustle was a distant memory, now replaced by the calm of rural life. With a final glance at La Belle Étoile, Miss Marple took a deep breath. The case had been far more than an explosion and a few missing passengers. It had been a study in deception. How easily people believed they could hide the truth when all it took was someone willing to look a little closer. She walked down the platform slowly, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestones, each step measured and deliberate. The mysteries of the train, the locks, the soot, and the passageways had all resolved themselves in the end. But the people, the ones who had acted out of greed, fear, or arrogance, were not so easily forgotten. As Miss Marple walked, she mentally reviewed the case. Duval's smooth, calculated demeanour had fooled nearly everyone, and yet in the end it was his overconfidence, his belief that no one would notice the small details that had betrayed him. The hidden passages, the duplicate key, the carefully planned explosion, each piece had been a clue leading her to the man who thought he was above suspicion. In the end it was a matter of perspective. The smallest details, so easily overlooked by others, had led Miss Marple to the truth. The soot on the walls, the misplaced key, the subtle tension between the passengers. All of it pointed in one direction. The truth was rarely as complicated as it seemed, but it was always hidden behind a layer of deception, waiting for someone with the patience to peel it away. The platform was quiet now, the train long gone, but the feeling of accomplishment settled over Miss Marple like a comfortable coat. It wasn't the thrill of victory that satisfied her. It was the certainty that justice had been served. The criminals were caught, the victims saved, and the truth was finally revealed. A modest carriage waited for Miss Marple at the station. She stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. As the coach began its journey toward her quiet village, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The countryside unfolded before her, the lush fields and quiet villages, a far cry from the tense atmosphere aboard the train. The case had been a reminder of the complexity of human nature, of the lies people told, the secrets they kept, and the way they believed they could control the world around them. But Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that nothing could remain hidden forever. The truth, though sometimes buried under layers of deceit, always found its way to the surface. As the carriage rumbled along the winding roads, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The case had been intricate, but not impossible. The true test of any mystery was not in how well it was concealed, but in how well it could be unravelled. And that, she thought with quiet satisfaction, was where her strength lay. There would always be more mysteries, more lies to uncover, and more deceit to expose. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most important thing was not the resolution of the case itself, but the certainty that justice, however long it took, always prevailed. As the carriage moved through the sleepy countryside, Miss Marple looked out the window, the early morning light bathing the world in a soft, warm glow. She had solved the case, but more than that, she had seen the truth. The way people, no matter how clever or careful, were never as hidden as they thought. There would always be a way through the lies, a way to see the reality beneath the surface. And as the carriage rolled on toward her quiet village, Miss Marple couldn't help but think that perhaps the real mystery was not the case she'd just solved, but the endless dance of deception and the unshakable certainty that no matter how deep the lies, the truth would always rise to the top. The world might not always be what it seemed, but that was exactly why Miss Marple was always watching, always waiting, because she knew nothing ever stays hidden forever.